Kieran Webb had developed a precise science of invisibility over his 4 months on Research Station Meridian 7, and he was rather proud of it. He arrived at Laboratory 3 at 5:45 hours each morning, exactly 15 minutes before the day shift began filtering in, which gave him time to review his work in blessed silence before the chaos of collaboration descended. He took his coffee black from the dispensary on Deck 4 rather than the main commissary, ate meals in his quarters while reading research papers, and had mapped every corridor and service tunnel to ensure maximum efficiency in avoiding unnecessary human contact. Well, not just human contact. Any contact, really, but especially contact with the station's newest arrival, who had turned his carefully ordered existence into a geometric nightmare of avoidance patterns. Princess Zareth of the Vale Ascendancy had arrived 6 weeks ago in a transport that was probably worth more than the entire research station, though she'd insisted on being assigned the same standard quarters as everyone else. The crew had been briefed extensively. She was royalty but preferred to be addressed as Doctor. She'd won the prestigious Cascade Prize at 23 for work that had fundamentally rewritten faster-than-light theory, and she was here to lead their quantum fold project for the next year. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was that she would be magnetic in a way that made Kieran's carefully cultivated isolation feel suddenly, painfully obvious. She moved through the station like she belonged everywhere, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of problems, laughing at jokes in the commissary with researchers who'd been standoffish for months, and worst of all, she kept trying to talk to Kieran. Not about anything important, just casual inquiries about his work, observations about the station's terrible coffee, attempts at the kind of small talk that Kieran had spent years learning to deflect. He'd perfected the art of the polite excuse, the apologetic escape, the sudden urgent need to check on an experiment that definitely couldn't wait. The problem was that Zareth was not just royal and accomplished. She was genuinely brilliant in ways that made Kieran feel like a first-year graduate student fumbling through someone else's notes. He'd read her papers obsessively, had built half his current research on foundations she'd laid, and the idea of actually collaborating with her while carrying the weight of his particular baggage felt like inviting catastrophe. So he avoided her with the same methodical precision he applied to his quantum calculations, rerouting his schedule around her patterns, taking stairs instead of lifts if he saw her entering, once actually hiding in a supply closet when he'd heard her voice approaching in the corridor. It was ridiculous. It was necessary. And it was apparently extremely obvious to everyone, including the station's AI, which was how he found himself working alone in Laboratory 7 at 300 hours when the door opened with its characteristic whisper, and Zareth walked in looking like she'd been awake for days and had reached the end of her considerable patience. "We need to talk," she said, not bothering with preamble, "about why you're avoiding me." Her long ears, elegantly tapered and currently tilted forward in what Kieran had learned indicated intense focus, caught the laboratory's ambient light in ways that made them seem almost translucent. She was wearing standard research coveralls rather than anything remotely royal, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her expression suggested she'd had quite enough of whatever game she thought he was playing. Kieran felt his stomach drop somewhere in the vicinity of his boots. "I'm not. Please don't insult my intelligence." She crossed the laboratory in 3 strides, stopping just outside what he'd unconsciously established as his safety perimeter. "I've been on this station for 6 weeks. In that time, you have altered 37 patterns in your daily routine to minimize contact with me. Station AI confirmed it when I asked. You've rerouted your path to the commissary 4 times. You take stairs instead of lifts. You actually hid in a storage closet last week. Yes, I saw you. And yes, I'm aware how absurd this entire situation has become." Heat crawled up Kieran's neck. Being caught was one thing. Having his avoidance quantified and analyzed was something else entirely. "It's not personal," he managed, which was both true and completely inadequate. "Then what is it?" Zareth moved closer, breaking his 2-meter buffer, and he had to actively resist the urge to step back. Because I've been trying to understand. At first, I thought perhaps you found Vale disturbing. Some humans do, though they're usually less subtle about it. But you work fine with researcher Halzen and engineer Kivara. You collaborated on that paper about entanglement networks with Halzen just last month. Actually had lunch with him twice according to the commissary logs. I absolutely did not obsessively review. You reviewed commissary logs. I'm trying to figure out what I did wrong. The frustration in her voice was raw enough to make Kieran flinch. Everyone else on this station talks to me. They ask questions, argue about theories, invite me to participate in their terrible movie nights where they show films that are apparently considered classics despite making no narrative sense. But you flee when I enter a room. You've turned social avoidance into an art form, and I need to know why because it's driving me absolutely insane. Kieran stared at her, watching the way her ears tilted slightly back in what might have been distress, seeing past the brilliant physicist and the royal title to something more vulnerable underneath. She actually cared. She thought she'd done something wrong, and she'd been carrying that assumption for weeks while he'd congratulated himself on his successful protective isolation. The ethical calculation should have been simple. Maintain the lie, keep her safe, except that she'd blame herself for his distance. But looking at her expression, hurt trying to hide behind scientific curiosity and royal composure, he found the math more complicated than any quantum equation he'd ever attempted to solve. You didn't do anything wrong, he said quietly. I'm avoiding you because getting close to me is dangerous and you're too valuable to risk. Zareth's ears went completely still, the Vale equivalent of absolute attention. Explain. So he did. The words came slowly at first, like extracting shrapnel from a wound he'd been trying to ignore. He told her about his previous work in intelligence, the classified projects he'd been part of before requesting transfer to pure research. Not the details. Those were locked too deep in his neural implant to access without proper authorization codes, but the shape of them, the weight. 3 months ago, he continued, pulling up an encrypted message on his personal display with hands that wanted to shake, I received this. From my former handler. Apparently, I'm on a target list for a Vale separatist faction called the Crimson Void Collective. Zareth's expression shifted through several configurations as she read, none of them good. They think you have intelligence about a quantum weapon prototype. They're wrong about what I know. The project was discontinued, the prototypes destroyed, but they don't believe that. Standard procedure for intelligence assets in this situation is isolation protocols until the threat is neutralized or transferred. He gestured vaguely at the empty laboratory around them. I've requested transfer 6 times in 3 months. Each request has been denied because apparently my work here is too critical to interrupt. So you've been isolating yourself. Zareth's voice was strange, carefully controlled in a way that suggested significant emotion underneath. Playing lone protector while station security does what, exactly? Monitors the situation. Their words, not mine. Kieran couldn't quite keep the bitterness out of his voice. Meanwhile, I do what I can, which is maintain distance from anyone who might become collateral damage, especially you. Especially me. Your Vale ascendancy royalty and the project's lead scientist. You'd be the perfect target, take you hostage, force me to decrypt information I don't actually have access to, cause a political incident between the ascendancy and humanity that could destabilize the entire sector. I won't let that happen. He met her eyes directly for the first time since she'd entered. So yes, I've been avoiding you. Not because of anything you did, but because every moment we spend in proximity is a moment you're at increased risk, and I've caused enough damage in my life without adding you to the list. The silence that followed felt geological in scope. Zareth stood perfectly still for a long moment, her ears doing something complicated that Kieran couldn't interpret. Then she stepped forward, fully inside his 1-meter safety buffer now, close enough that he could see the faint bioluminescent patterns on her skin that marked her as high caste veil. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet and absolutely furious. "That," she said precisely, "is the stupidest, most noble, most infuriating thing I have ever heard in my entire life." Kieran blinked. "I'm trying to keep you safe. You're trying to be a martyr. You're living in complete isolation, treating yourself like some kind of walking biohazard, carrying this burden alone because you've apparently decided that you're responsible for protecting everyone around you from threats they don't even know exist." Her ears were fully back now, flat against her skull. "Did it occur to you, even once, to tell someone, to ask for help, to inform the one person on this station who has both the security clearance and the personal motivation to actually do something about this situation? I was protecting you by treating me like I'm made of glass, like I'm some delicate thing that needs to be kept in isolation." Zareth laughed, sharp and bright. "Kieran, I'm Vale royalty. I've been trained in combat since I was 6 years old. I have 3 personal guards in stealth positions around this station that you've never noticed because they're actually competent at their jobs. And I have security resources that make your intelligence clearance look like a child's toy." She pulled up her own display, accessing files with classification levels that made Kieran's eyes widen. "The Crimson Void Collective has been quiet for 2 months. Station intelligence knows exactly why, but hasn't shared with you because you're not technically military personnel anymore, and information compartmentalization is apparently more important than basic human decency. They've shifted their focus to a new target, a cargo route near the Helix Nebula carrying actual weapons-grade materials. You're no longer their priority. You haven't been for 8 weeks. Kieran stared at the intelligence reports, feeling something unknot in his chest that had been tight for so long he'd forgotten what breathing fully felt like. Station security knew this. "Station security," Zareth said with the kind of cold precision that suggested someone was going to have a very uncomfortable conversation in the near future, "has apparently been operating under the assumption that you didn't need to know your threat level had changed. Because bureaucracy is the same across all species, inefficient, territorial, and often casually cruel." She closed the display and looked at him with an expression that mixed exasperation and something that might have been concern. "You've been carrying this alone, playing hero, slowly disappearing from your own life because you thought it would keep everyone safe. How long were you planning to keep this up? Until you transferred? Until you'd isolated yourself so completely that you forgot how to connect with anyone?" The question hit harder than Kieran expected. He'd been so focused on the immediate threat, on maintaining protective distance, that he hadn't thought about the long-term cost, hadn't considered what he was becoming in the process of trying to keep everyone else safe. "I didn't know what else to do," he said finally, and the honesty of it felt like admitting defeat. Zareth's expression softened slightly, her ears tilting to a more neutral position. "You could have talked to me. You could have trusted me to be capable of handling difficult information. You could have treated me like a colleague instead of a liability." She paused. "When was the last time you had a meal with another person, a real conversation about something other than work?" Kieran tried to remember and came up empty. The past 3 months were a blur of solitary meals and laboratory sessions, of carefully maintained distance and increasing isolation. "I don't know." "That's what I thought." Zareth gestured at the laboratory around them. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to save your work. We're going to go to the commissary. Yes, even though it's 300 hours, the Sessin run night shift, and their breakfast fungus is actually acceptable. And you're going to tell me about something that isn't quantum mechanics. Then tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation with station security about their information-sharing protocols. And after that, we're going to actually collaborate on this research project instead of working in parallel isolation while I wonder what I did to offend you." "You didn't offend me. I know that now. But I didn't know it for 6 weeks, and that's 6 weeks I spent assuming I'd somehow failed at basic social interaction with one of my scientific heroes. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was simply data rather than anything emotionally weighted. Kieran felt something shift in his chest. Scientific hero is overstating it. But you wrote the foundational paper on quantum entanglement networks. I cited you 17 times in my Cascade Prize work. You're one of the primary reasons I requested assignment to this station. I thought working with you would be the opportunity of a lifetime. Instead, I got 3 months of watching you hide in supply closets. Her expression turned wry. We're both idiots, apparently. You isolating yourself to protect me from threats that no longer exist, me thinking I'd somehow managed to offend one of the few people whose work I genuinely respect. But the absurdity of it hit Kieran all at once. Two brilliant people, both miserable, both operating on incomplete information and catastrophic assumptions. He laughed, surprising himself with the sound. When you put it that way, it does seem somewhat inefficient. Somewhat. Zareth moved toward the door, then paused. Are you coming? Because the Sessing fungus really doesn't wait, and I've been wanting to talk to you about your entanglement network theory for 6 weeks. Kieran looked at his work display, at the simulations he'd been running in solitary isolation, at the careful architecture of a life designed around protective distance. Then he looked at Zareth, standing in the doorway with an expression that suggested she'd wait as long as necessary, but would prefer not to wait all night, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Yes, he said, saving his work with fingers that felt steadier than they had in months. Let's get breakfast. The commissary at 300 hours was a strange liminal space, occupied by the handful of researchers who either couldn't sleep or preferred working night shifts when the station was quieter. The Sessing chef, a being that resembled a collection of crystalline structures operating in apparent defiance of biology, produced something that looked alarming but smelled surprisingly edible. Kieran and Zareth found a corner table with a view of the gas giant the station orbited, its storms creating patterns that looked like abstract art rendered in hydrogen and helium. For the first time in months, Kieran didn't automatically scan for exits or calculate threat vectors. He just sat across from someone who was somehow both a princess and a colleague, holding a plate of fungus that tasted better than it had any right to, and tried to remember how to have a conversation that wasn't about work. So, Zareth said, breaking off a piece of the fungus with the kind of delicate precision she probably applied to everything. Tell me something non-scientific. I've read all your papers, I know your research inside and out, but I don't actually know anything about you as a person. What do you do when you're not avoiding me or running quantum simulations? Kieran considered the question and came up embarrassingly empty. I read research papers mostly. Sometimes historical fiction, though I'm told my taste runs toward the obscure. Obscure historical fiction, that tracks actually. Her ears tilted forward in what might have been amusement. What else? I used to play violin. Haven't in years. There wasn't much call for it in intelligence work, and I haven't picked it up since transferring to research. He paused. This is a depressing conversation, isn't it? I'm realizing I don't actually have hobbies or interests beyond work. We can work on that. Everyone needs something beyond their primary function. Otherwise, you just become your job and forget there's a person underneath. Zareth took a sip of her coffee and made a face. This tastes like someone's theoretical idea of what coffee should be, filtered through a committee that's never actually encountered coffee beans. That's the most accurate description of station coffee I've ever heard. I have a gift for precise complaint. It's one of my few talents beyond quantum mathematics. She set the cup down with a grimace. Growing up royal, you learn to be politely dissatisfied with everything while appearing gracious. It's exhausting, actually. One of the reasons I went into science. It's the one place where being bluntly honest about problems is not only acceptable but required. Kieran found himself genuinely curious. What's it like? Growing up royal, I mean. The briefings were all political structure and protocol, but they didn't really cover the personal aspects. Zareth was quiet for a moment, her long fingers tracing patterns on the table's surface. Isolating, she said finally. You're always being watched, always being judged, always representing something larger than yourself. Every interaction is filtered through protocol. Every friendship is examined for political implications. Every choice is analyzed for what it says about the ascendancy as a whole. You learn very quickly that people are usually talking to your title rather than to you, and you adjust accordingly. That sounds lonely. It was. I chose science specifically because it was the one field where my work would be judged on its merits rather than my bloodline. Where I could be Dr. Zareth, who happens to be royal, rather than Princess Zareth, who dabbles in physics. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. Which is why it's been so frustrating having you avoid me. I finally get to a research station where my title should be irrelevant, where I can just be a scientist collaborating with other scientists, and the one person whose work I most respect treats me like I'm radioactive. The guilt of that landed heavily. I'm sorry, truly. I was so focused on keeping you safe from external threats that I didn't consider I might be creating a different kind of harm. Apology accepted, though you're going to have to make up for 6 weeks of missed collaboration. Zareth's expression turned more serious. Can I ask, what was it like? Intelligence work. You don't have to share if it's classified or painful, but I'm curious about what draws someone from that world into pure research. Kieran considered how much to say, how much he could say, and decided that after everything else he'd already revealed, a little more honesty wouldn't hurt. It's all pattern recognition and analysis, really. Finding signals in noise, predicting behaviors, understanding systems whether they're quantum or political. The mathematics are surprisingly similar. But intelligence work is always reactive. You're always responding to threats, preventing disasters, cleaning up messes. Pure research felt like the opposite. Proactive. Building towards something instead of just preventing catastrophes. Though apparently, you brought some of the catastrophe prevention mindset with you. Occupational hazard. Once you've spent years thinking in terms of threat assessment and risk mitigation, it's hard to just turn that off. He paused. The hardest part was trusting people again. In intelligence, everyone's a potential asset or threat. Information is compartmentalized. Relationships are strategic, and genuine connection is usually a liability. I thought I could leave that behind, but it turns out the paranoia follows you. Is that what the isolation was? Paranoia. Self-preservation disguised as nobility. Though I'm starting to realize those aren't actually different things. They're both just fear wearing different masks. Kieran surprised himself with the admission. I convinced myself I was protecting you, protecting the station, but really I was just trying to control an uncontrollable situation by removing myself from the equation. Zareth nodded slowly. I understand that impulse. Royal training is essentially one long exercise in learning to control your environment through careful management of variables. But there's a difference between healthy caution and pathological isolation. You were trending toward the latter. You're having breakfast with me at 300 hours and admitting to patterns of behavior that clearly make you uncomfortable. That's progress. She smiled slightly. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. We'll work on the rest. They talked for another hour, the conversation drifting through topics that had nothing to do with quantum mechanics, veil music theory that was apparently based on mathematical principles humans couldn't easily hear, human literature that Zareth found simultaneously fascinating and narratively chaotic, the shared frustration of trying to explain complex ideas to administrators who just wanted results without understanding process. At some point, the night shift began transitioning to day, and the commissary started filling with early risers who looked mildly surprised to see both lead scientists having breakfast together. We're going to be the subject of significant gossip, Zareth observed, watching a pair of junior researchers very obviously not staring at them. Probably been gossip for weeks about why I've been avoiding you. Oh, definitely. I've heard at least 3 different theories, ranging from he's terrified of royalty, to he's secretly working on a competing project, to my personal favorite. He's allergic to veil pheromones and is too polite to mention it. Kieran nearly choked on his coffee. Allergic to pheromones. Research stations breed creative speculation when people are bored. Zareth stood, gathering her empty dishes. Come on. We've been up all night. We both probably need actual sleep. And tomorrow we're going to have words with station security about their information-sharing protocols. Looking forward to watching that conversation. You're participating in that conversation. They failed both of us. You by not updating threat assessments, me by not informing the project lead that one of her key researchers was operating under active threat conditions. Someone's performance review is going to be very uncomfortable. Her expression was pleasant, but there was steel underneath that suggested her royal training included more than just polite dissatisfaction. They walked back through the station together, no longer maintaining careful distance, and Kieran felt something that had been tight in his chest for months finally begin to unwind. The threats hadn't disappeared. The Crimson Void Collective still existed, station security was still incompetent, and his past in intelligence would always carry certain risks. But he wasn't carrying it alone anymore, and that changed the mathematics of everything. At the junction where their quarters diverged, Zareth paused. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me the truth, even though it took me cornering you in a laboratory to extract it. Thank you for cornering me, and for not accepting the easier lie." Kieran hesitated, then added, "I've read your work for years. It's intimidating. You're intimidating. But I'm glad I finally get to actually know you rather than just your research papers. I'm glad you're finally willing to be in the same room as me, without calculating escape routes." Her ears tilted in what he was learning to recognize as genuine amusement. "Get some sleep, Kieran. Tomorrow we have a station security department to traumatize and a research project to actually make progress on." He watched her disappear down the corridor toward the royal quarters she'd insisted on not using, then made his way to his own modest room. For the first time in months, he fell asleep without running through threat scenarios or calculating risk assessments. Instead, he thought about breakfast conversations and collaborative research, and the strange relief of finally telling someone the truth, especially when, that truth was difficult and complicated and inconvenient. Outside his window, the gas giant continued its eternal rotation, storms swirling in patterns that suggested both chaos and underlying order. Kieran dreamed of quantum states and violin music, of equations that balanced and isolation that finally ended, and woke 6 hours later feeling more rested than he had in months. The conversation with station security was indeed uncomfortable, though Zareth handled it with the kind of polite ruthlessness that came from years of royal training. By the end of the meeting, threat assessment protocols had been comprehensively revised, information-sharing procedures had been overhauled, and the security chief looked like he'd aged several years in the span of an hour. Kieran almost felt sorry for him, but then remembered 3 months of unnecessary isolation and decided sympathy could wait. The real work began after that, actual collaboration instead of parallel isolation. They set up shared laboratory time, reviewed each other's research with the kind of constructive criticism that only came from mutual respect, and slowly began making progress on the quantum fold project that had been stagnating for months. Turns out combining Kieran's practical engineering approach with Zareth's theoretical brilliance produced results neither could achieve alone. "We should have been doing this from the beginning," Zareth said one afternoon, reviewing simulations that finally showed promising results. "Months wasted because you were busy being a tragic hero, and I was busy being offended. Let's call it an extended warming-up period." Let's call it what it was. Mutual stupidity driven by incomplete information and terrible communication. But she smiled as she said it, and Kieran found himself smiling back. They still had challenges ahead, research that would take years, political complications